Hi guys. It's been a while. What I say a while, it's been like a couple of weeks maybe. I was meant to only take like a week off from posting after October, and then I took longer. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane and I paint crap on my face. Yeah, I had a little break after October because October was insane. And I was basically a hermit for the entire month. So it took a little bit of time to spend with family and some friends, recharge a little bit, but we are back. I currently look like an egg, which can only mean one thing. I'm talking myths, I'm talking monsters, and definitely some makeup. My skin has broken out so badly after October, not because I was doing all of the big, heavy, crazy looks, but because I'm now not doing them. Because in between all those looks, I was meticulously washing my face and cleaning my skin. And I'm not gonna lie, I've been a bit lax with it. And this is the result. But it's fine, because I'm just gonna cover it with more face paint today. So, if you're not familiar with these types of videos, this is a little series that I have on my channel where I do some kind of transformative makeup look inspired by a particular myth or legend or mythical creature, and during which I just verbal diarrhea info dump the lore and history behind that creature. For the month of October, I was doing sort of spooky, Halloween specific related topics and videos, but we are back to our regularly scheduled programming, semi-regularly, but we're just delving back into sort of regular myth and legend, which to be fair are usually quite horrifying anyway. So today's topic is one that I have wanted to cover since I started this series, and the research took me so much longer than I thought it would. Today we are talking about sirens. Not to be confused with mermaids, but we'll get into that. So strap yourselves in, because this is going to be a long one. Shameless self-promo moment for a second. Please make sure you are subscribed, notification bells on, yada 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 yada, just so that you don't miss any of these videos that get uploaded or any updates relating to these videos, that kind of thing. Other than that, I will quit waffling, I will go get ready, and then we can start. For those of you who are interested in like the makeup side of things, all the products that I use will be linked and listed in the description box down below. I also apologise in advance for any and all errors in pronunciation of words and names and places. I do try my best with how things should actually be said, but when you're looking at like ancient languages and like, oh my god, the words are so hard. Please feel free to correct me on any of them if I do get them wrong. Like that, I do genuinely really try. So, sirens. Picture a siren and you'll typically think of a female mermaid-esque creature, generally with like a really beautiful face and a really beautiful voice, who sing and lure sailors ultimately to their death. The beautiful face is a bit of a contested one, because that's not always the case. Sometimes they are a lot more monstrous, but generally speaking, it's the voice. The beautiful voice is the thing that people think of. Sirens are often put in the same category, and in some cases confused with things like mermaids, but also like selkies and kelpies and a whole host of other aquatic mythical beings. Now, the whole concept of the siren and her song, usually in relation to sailors and fishermen, is that their song is so alluring and so like almost hypnotizing that anyone who hears it will become entranced by it and fixated on it. And in some cases it can send them to sleep, other cases it puts them in like a catatonic, comatose kind of state, but the most commonly associated thing is that it will basically just hypnotize them into moving off course and trying to get closer to the sound, with the end result being that this person is lured to their death, either by being dragged into the water by the sirens themselves and then drowning, walking off the side of the ship of their own accord and again drowning, or in some cases like going so off course that they take the ship with them and just basically shipwreck themselves. While the concept of the whole beautiful face, beautiful voice is fairly accurate to the myth of the sirens, the origins of a siren are actually much more closely related to harpies than they are to the typical mermaid figure that we think of nowadays, because they were originally part woman, part bird. There are some who believed that sirens evolved from a really early tale about like the perils of exploration, and that this was then combined with the Asian image of a bird woman known as a soul bird. And it was basically like a winged ghost that stole away the living to share their fate, which again is quite similar to the idea of a harpy. But sirens as we know them originated once again in Greek mythology, but they remained very prominent during early Christian, medieval times, classic literature, the Renaissance, and like even today they are still featured quite prominently in modern media. A very relevant example being the whole siren eyes makeup trend on TikTok. Now, there are numerous creatures in different folklore around the whole world that depict this idea of the beautiful but dangerous woman, some of which are based very much directly on the Greek myth of sirens, and others have their own sort of folklore and their own tales associated with it. As such, the term siren nowadays is generally used to just refer to a woman who is considered both very attractive and dangerous, and the term siren song has become its own thing as well, usually to refer to something that is like seductive or tempting, but kind of deceptive in its appeal, and is really difficult to resist, but will lead to a negative outcome. Okay, so this is already looking all kinds of crazy. I do have a plan. Now, to look at the origin of the siren, we do need to go once again to ancient Greece. The origin and like the etymology of the word siren has been interpreted in like a few different ways with no like known correct answer. There are some suggestions that the word actually has a pre-Greek origin, which refers to a lot of the unknown languages that were spoken in prehistoric Greece. Others connect the word siren to the Greek word seira, which means like rope or cord, and aero, which means like to tie or join or fasten. This results in the meaning of like the binder or entangler, the idea being someone who binds or entangles through the use of magic song. This idea of like binding or entangling could also be in connection with the famous scene in Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus is bound to the mast of his ship in order to resist the siren song. Homer's Odyssey is actually where the sirens first appear within Greek mythology, and it's one of the two major ancient Greek epic poems that is attributed to Homer, the other being the Iliad. Both of these poems in particular, along with the work of Hesiod, who I spoke a lot about in my like Gorgon and Medusa video, they're basically like the foundations of ancient Greek literature as a whole. Homer in particular is actually considered to be like one of the most revered and influential authors like ever in history. But yeah, between Homer and Hesiod, they're considered like the founding fathers of Greek mythology. Now, the story of Odyssey, or the Odyssey, chronicles the 10-year journey of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, back to his home after the fall of Troy. Both the Iliad and the Odyssey depict man's struggle, but specifically the Odyssey, because it details Odysseus's perseverance through the punishment of the gods. I read like a brief summary of the whole thing. Like, I can't lie, it does make for some good reading. So the poem is divided into 24 books, and the encounter with the sirens is between like book 9 and 12. Now, the encounter with the sirens isn't told in like a live action story in that sense. It's Odysseus retelling his experiences and his encounters to the Phaeacians of an island called Sharia, which is his like final stop on his way back to Ithaca. As with anything to do with Greek mythology, it gets real confusing real fast, so please just bear with me. Odysseus's like story and general experiences that he's like retelling to these people is insane. It's just tales of his ship constantly being driven off course, encounters with these lotus eaters who make his entire crew forget where they came from, an encounter with Polyphemus, who is the one-eyed giant son of Poseidon who ate a bunch of his crew, and then even more encounters with another tribe of like man-eating giants, then a year-long stay with the witch Circe, who actually eventually then gives Odysseus instructions on how to navigate the oceans and the steps that he needs to take to return home. So Circe seems kind of cool. But yeah, all these epic tales and adventures eventually lead to the land of the Sirens, which they sailed around, and on Circe's instructions, all of Odysseus's crew had their ears plugged with beeswax so that they couldn't hear them singing. Apart from Odysseus himself, because he was curious as to what the song would sound like to him, so he tied himself to the mast of the ship and instructed his crew to basically, no matter how much he begged, under no circumstances untie him. Whilst I don't think it's mentioned in the Odyssey itself, I did find a number of references to the idea that the Sirens in this scenario became so distressed at the sight of a man being able to hear their song and still being able to escape that they threw themselves into the sea and then drowned. Now, while this is the first mention of sirens within Greek mythology, Homer never actually provides any kind of physical description for their appearance or what they look like, so it's just left up to the reader's imagination. It wasn't until the epic poem Argonautica, written in 3rd century BC, that actually provided any kind of description for the sirens, and it's here where they're described as part woman, part bird. Similarly to the Gorgons, more details of the sirens' origins and the mythology surrounding them were added as years went on by later writers and later tales. Now, according to the Roman poet Ovid, who again I mentioned in the Gorgon video because he added a lot to that tale, the sirens were originally the companions or handmaidens of a young Persephone. Persephone being the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, who goes on to become the queen of the underworld after she's abducted by her uncle Hades, who also would later go on to marry her. I keep saying, just Greek mythology, man. It's infinitely fascinating and just so confusing. Also very dramatic as well. Anyway, in this particular iteration, after Persephone is abducted by Hades, Demeter grants the sirens wings in order to go and search for her. But there are some later tales in which Demeter actually curses the sirens for failing to protect Persephone against being abducted in the first place, and this is where it was referenced that sirens would only be fated to live until a mortal heard their song and was able to pass by them. Hence, when Odysseus was able to pass by them, they threw themselves into the sea. If it wasn't for the green neck right now, this is very much Blue Man Group vibes. Not quite the direction I was going for right now, but now naturally there is yet another tale involving sirens, but this time it involves Hera, who is the queen of the gods and Zeus's wife. And in this instance, she persuaded the sirens to enter a singing competition with the Muses. Now, the Muses were the inspirational goddesses of literature and science and the arts, and were kind of considered the source of any knowledge that was embodied in poetry or lyrical songs or myths that were told by word of mouth in ancient Greece. So, fairly big deal. The Muses won this competition and then plucked out all of the sirens' feathers and made crowns out of them, which is kind of horrifying, actually. Now, in their anguish at losing this competition, the sirens then turned completely white and fell into the sea, where they then formed the islands in a bay that were called the Leucae, or the White Ones. Now, the Leucae, or the Leucae, as we know it today, is called Suda, which is an islet in Suda Bay in the northwest coast of Crete. Now, this little islet is almost round in shape, and it was referred to as Rabbit Island on medieval Venetian maps. And these are the islands that the sirens were said to have created, basically. Similar to the story of Perseus defeating Atlas and turning him to stone using the head of Medusa, which then formed a mountain range in northern Africa. I always love any kind of folklore or mythology that has links to things that are still present today, or the formation of things that we still know today, if that makes sense. I don't know what it is about it just being able to see something that is said to have formed from this mythological story, it just adds another level to these stories for me, and I love it. Now, going back to the poem of the Argonautica, the sirens are mentioned in Book 4, when the ancient Greek hero and leader of the Argonauts, a man called Jason of all things, and his men sail past them. However, they also have Orpheus on board, who was a Thracian bard and just legendary musician, not the Githyanki prince in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, when Orpheus hears the Sirens begin to sing and use their siren song, he draws out his lyre and basically plays his own music, infinitely louder and more beautiful than theirs, which drowns out their voices and allows the crew to sail past. As such, the crew were able to pass by them safely and unharmed, apart from one who somehow still managed to hear their song and then threw himself into the sea, but he was then caught and carried away to safety by Aphrodite. So, now while the Argonautica was the first to provide any kind of written description of the Sirens' physical appearance, in the Odyssey, when Odysseus stays with Circe, she does describe the setting of the Sirens. They are described as lolling there in their meadow, around them heaps of corpses rotting away, rags of skin shrivelling on their bones, which is just so vividly descriptive. Based on this description in particular, some later writers have implied that the Sirens actually ate humans, and some comparisons have then been made to the Care, which are like these female death spirits. They are goddesses who personified violent death and who were drawn to these like bloody deaths on the battlefield. But in terms of like a comparison, Sirens have also been compared to things like the Sphinx, in that they are what is known as a mantic creature, which relates to the manticore from Persian mythology, which is a creature with the head of a human, the body of a lion, and the tail of a scorpion. But just going back to Circe's description of them in their meadow, surrounded by these like corpses and bodies, a lot of people have pointed out that the fact that this description states that the bodies still have their flesh on them, like rotting away, it suggests that the bodies were in fact not eaten, and that where the Sirens had their feathers stolen by the Muses after the competition, it was their divine nature that kept them alive, and where sailors would have been lured into their meadow, they would have been unable to provide food for them, so the sailors would eventually starve to death because they were still under the influence of the song, so just refused to leave. Now, the tales from the Argonautica and the Odyssey cover the very first sort of iterations of Sirens within Greek mythology, but there is a lot more history to them, and as with most myths and mythological creatures, the mythology surrounding them developed and evolved a lot over time. Now, according to the ancient Hebrew book of Enoch, which was described as an ancient Jewish apocalyptic religious text, women who were led astray by fallen angels were fated to be turned into Sirens. If we then jump forward to sort of around the 4th century, during a time when pagan beliefs were being overtaken by Christianity, which has been a feature in quite a few of my mythology videos now, actually, that I think about it. The belief in literal Sirens, like the creatures actually existing, like most things, was very, very heavily discouraged. They instead began describing Sirens as these beautiful, like, courtesans or prostitutes who would sing a pleasant melody to men, and they basically became symbolic of, like, the vices of pleasure, which was reiterated by later Christian writers who continued with this, like, notion that the siren stood as a symbol for worldly temptations rather than an endorsement of Greek mythology. There's an early Christian euhemerist interpretation of Sirens, and euhemerism is basically where people look at mythological tales with the idea that they originated from a real historical event or person, and it suggests that their sort of retelling over time has become very exaggerated, which has then resulted in this big dramatic story with creatures and whatever else. This particular interpretation states that the Greeks imagined 3 sirens, part virgin, part bird, with wings and claws. One of them sang, one of them played the flute, and the other played the lyre, and they lured sailors in with their song in order to shipwreck them. However, the truth of the myth is that the Sirens were in fact prostitutes who would lure travellers or sailors and travelling fishermen, who led them into poverty to impose shipwreck on them and lead them to ruin, basically. And the idea of wings and claws was because love flies and wounds. And they were said to have stayed in the waves in like the ocean because it was a wave that created Venus, who was the goddess of love, beauty, desire, and sex. Personally, I think I prefer the original Greek story about them. As you start to move more into like the Middle Ages and the Medieval Ages, this is where you sort of start to see the shift in description and physiology of the sirens from bird creatures to more of the mermaid-esque figure that we think of now. Now, the sirens appeared in a single chapter of something called the Physiologus, which was a Christian text written sometime between like the 2nd and 4th century AD by an unknown author, and the sirens appear alongside something known as the Ono Centaur, which translates to donkey centaur, which is like a legendary creature from ancient folklore and medieval bestiaries. Now, bestiaries are basically like illustrated books on creatures and beasts and things like that. Fun little side note about the Ono Centaur, because I'd never heard of it before, but it is often depicted as only having 2 legs with no like front legs on the donkey part. So in all of these like illustrations of it, it just constantly looks like it's falling over. Now, the bird-like depiction of the siren from the classical like Greek sources was kept in the Latin version of the Physiologus from the 6th century, and a number of subsequent bestiaries all the way up into the 13th century. But it was sometime during this that the mermaid shape was like introduced and started becoming associated with sirens. Now, some people believe that the change of the medieval siren from like bird to fish came from the influence of Teutonic myth, I believe it's pronounced. Now, the Teutons were like an ancient northern European tribe that was mentioned by Roman authors. Now, in the mid-9th century, the siren was illustrated as a woman-fish hybrid in yet another translation of the Physiologus, but the text like attached to the image still described them as like avian. There was yet another bestiary dated sometime between like 1220 and 1250 that also depicted a group of sirens as part woman, part fish, with like fishtails swimming around in the ocean. But again, the text described them as resembling like winged fowl down to their feet. The earliest known like text description of sirens having these like mermaid fishtails occurs in a late 7th to 8th century catalogue of marvellous creatures, which described them as sea girls whose beauty in form and sweet song would lure sailors, but beneath the human head and torso they had the scaly tail end of a fish with which they could navigate through the sea. I was really hoping there was going to be some kind of like story or tale associated with why they changed from like bird creatures into mermaids, but it was just like a gradual change over time, and I couldn't find one specific reason as to why. The only thing I could maybe think of is that because they were associated with like sailors and shipwrecks, maybe that's why they started being thought of as more like fishy creatures rather than birds. But the illustration of sirens as purely like the mermaid fish variety became common on like the second family of bestiaries, like the second editions, I guess. And she was often shown holding like a musical instrument, or in some cases holding like a weird eel type fish. Although there were actually a few examples where the siren was depicted as like a hybrid of both a fish and a bird. So she had a human head and torso, a fish tail and lower body, but bird wings and feet sometimes, and the wings sometimes coming from like her shoulder blades or out of her shoulders, and in other cases coming out around her hips. Now, in some bestiaries, the siren was also depicted as holding like a comb or a mirror, in relation to them apparently being very vain creatures, though the idea of like the mirror and the comb especially has become much more synonymous with mermaids instead. It's particularly sort of in Europe. There were a number of pieces of like medieval literature that just completely mixed together sirens and mermaids. whilst stating the physiologists as their source. So again, it's a very gradual process that this sort of crossover seems to have happened, and there's no one clear reason or event as to why it happened. Now, as you come into the Renaissance, female court musicians, known as courtesans, filled the role of an unmarried companion. However, musical performances by unmarried women were seen as immoral, so being seen as a creature that could control a man's reasoning and tempt him, female singers and courtesans were associated with the mythological figure of the siren. Leonardo da Vinci even wrote about sirens in one of his notebooks, stating, "The siren sings so sweetly that she lulls the mariners to sleep, then she climbs upon the ship and kills the sleeping mariners." Now, despite the attempts of early Christians to portray sirens as being symbolic rather than literal creatures, in the 17th century there were some Jesuit writers who began referring to their actual existence. Side note, because I did have to look it up, a Jesuit is a member of the Society of Jesus, which is a Catholic religious order of priests and brothers, and they are the largest male religious order within the Catholic Church. They're dedicated to a lot of the same things as other Catholic religious orders, including the 3 lifelong vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. However, the Jesuits also have a 4th vow, which is a commitment to being available to go to work wherever the needs of the church or the world are the most pressing. So because of this, they're sometimes referred to as God's soldiers. But yeah, some Jesuit writers did make references to sirens as being real creatures. There was one example I found of a Jesuit writer who, when they were describing just a woman, said, "Her glance is that of the fabled basilisk, her voice a siren's voice. With her voice she enchants, with her beauty she deprives of reason. Voice and sight alike deal destruction and death." Which, I'm not gonna lie, if you take away maybe some of the context with which that was written, it's a very badass way of being described. But there were several other Jesuits who argued about their existence, including one who argued that they must have had a compartment built for them on board Noah's Ark, which is something I had never considered before. People make jokes all the time about the reasons unicorns don't exist anymore is because they forgot to let them on the Ark, that kind of thing. But it never occurred to me, with all the debates and history surrounding mythological creatures, the idea that obviously some people would believe they would have these compartments and spaces on the Ark. Now, despite all this back and forth about the origins of the word and what they mean, whether they were real, that kind of thing, once you get into the timeline of 1800 to 1900, a lot of writers attributed the origin of the word siren to a Phoenician term meaning songstress. Phoenician was an extinct language in areas of what we now know as Lebanon, but it expanded on the idea that sirens in ancient times were likely a number of lascivious women in Sicily who, whilst very gifted and excellent singers, had very corrupt morals and would seduce and prostitute themselves to travellers and sailors and fishermen, and made them forget their pursuits whilst drowning in unlawful pleasures. In the same way that Medusa became sort of symbolic of the nasty woman, sirens have now become symbolic of a dangerous woman, or specifically the dangerous seductress, with comparisons being drawn to things like succubi and the sort of femme fatale type character. Just as a side note as well, whilst succubi still fall under the realm of malevolent being that seduce men, they actually fall into the realm of dream demons, with the male version being the incubi. Both infinitely fascinating, and the whole topic of dream demons as well is I will be doing an episode on that at some point because it is so fascinating. If you'd rather see that sooner than later, let me know. Okay, I need to do some precise line work, so bear with me just a second. Okay, I think the vision is starting together. I mentioned earlier, obviously, the relevance of sirens on social media at the moment, with the whole trend of the siren eyes thing, both in the form of makeup, as basically just an elongated cat eye, but also in acting acting challenges and like showcasing the difference between like doe eyes and siren eyes. Doe eyes being the big round innocent eyes, siren being the elongated, very seductive eye. I've noticed as well that especially with things like this, a lot of the younger generations of women are starting to sort of reclaim the idea of a siren as a bit of a representative of what has become known as dark feminine energy, and sort of retaking the power that is associated with sirens after centuries of sirens and women in general being seen as these immoral, sinful seductresses. Women are sort of reclaiming the power that they have in that seductive element. Because sirens are depicted in modern media like quite a lot as well, sometimes directly as just sirens, and other times as kind of like a fusion between a siren and a mermaid. Some of the most notable examples and the ones that I can remember is in one of the Pirates of the Caribbean films. It's the mermaids of Whitecap Bay, these beautiful creatures who lure the sailors into the water with their song, and then they transform once under the water. Their eyes change, their pupils change, and like these almost like vampiric fangs appear. Even the Neverland mermaids from the 2003 Peter Pan film were presented in a very similar way. They used to lure children into the water with sweet singing, and then again they would change and transform into these really terrifying creatures with like white skin and like gilled fingers, and again just razor sharp teeth. Sirens as well have also been featured in numerous TV shows. Once again, Supernatural did a little segment on them, programs like Charmed, and I remember even the episode of Red Dwarf had the sirens but spelt with a silent P. Now, most modern depictions of sirens and generally what people think of when they hear the word comes from the ancient Greek tales. There are numerous other creatures from other folklore and mythology just around the world that depict the dangerous but beautiful woman, each often with their own stories and origins. The first one that I wanted to look at is regarding a 132 metre high steep slate rock on the banks of the River Rhine in Germany known as the Lorelei. Now this particular rock, whilst being beautiful in terms of geography and scenery in general, is known as an infamous maritime disaster spot since like the 10th century, and one of the explanations for it having this reputation is to do with sirens. More specifically, it is to do with a single siren. Now the name Lorelei comes from the old German word Lurin, which is Rhine dialect for murmuring, and the old German term ley meaning rock. The translation then being murmur rock or murmuring rock. Now surrounding this rock are some extremely heavy currents, and there's like a small waterfall near the area that was still visible in like the 19th century that produced this sort of murmuring sound. And combined with the special echo that the rock creates over the River Rhine, it amplifies the sound, which gives the rock its name. Now, whilst it's still there, the murmuring is really hard to hear nowadays because of like all the urbanization in the area, but it does still happen. Now, there is a super old legend attributing the murmur of the rock to a group of dwarves living in caves within the rock. However, the most well-known folklore actually came from a poem written in 1801 by the German author Clemens Brentano, but the poem tells the tale of the beautiful Lorelei who was betrayed by her sweetheart, and then she was accused of like bewitching men and causing their deaths. Now, rather than being sentenced to death herself, she was confined to a nunnery, and while she was being accompanied by 3 guards on her way there, they came upon Lorelei Rock. Now, she asked the guards for permission to climb the rock so that she can look out onto the river one last time, which they let her do. So she climbs up, she looks out, but she believes that she can see her love, her sweetheart, in the river, and in her attempts to try to get to him, she falls to her death, and the rock then retains an echo of her name. In 1824, this particular legend and tale was expanded on by another poet, Henry Heine. He described the woman, Lorelei, as a kind of siren who sat on the cliff of Lorelei Rock by the Rhine, combing her golden hair with a golden comb, and her spirit sings this like haunting melody that acts almost like a spell and is powerful enough to lead sailors to their deaths. And the murmur from the rock and the waters was said to be the remnants of her voice in the water. The more I looked into it, the more fascinating it was, because there is actually a statue and a fountain both dedicated and depicting the Siren of Lorelei Rock. Now, in Swedish folklore, there is a creature called the SCLERA, who are these like female humanoid water spirits. Now, they're part of a bigger group of spirits known as the RCMA. Again, I'm sorry if I got it wrong, I'm really trying. They are part of Scandinavian folklore, and specifically they are spirits who are keepers or wardens of particular landforms or places, and they tended to have like influence over the land and the wildlife, so it was very important and very practiced for humans to sort of cultivate good relationships with them in order to receive blessings and good fortune, that kind of thing. Now the SCLERA, or Mistress of the Lake, were keepers of the lake. They were often pictured sitting among the rocks, combing their long hair, and they would lure in and drown men who had been unfaithful or unkind or otherwise sort of disrespectful to her or the lake. Now, as with any of the Ra, she would protect her domain and reward those who were respectful to her and the surroundings with like good luck during fishing, or in some cases even saving people from drowning. It was said as well that during the winter she would stick her hand up out of the lake, and any visitor who presented with or gave her a mitten would be given gifts and rewards or offered protection in a time of need. A very interesting little side story on this though. In 1640, there was a man named Peter Johnson who was actually executed for allegedly having relations with a SCLERA. Whilst there are actually several stories of this nature from the sort of 17th century Sweden, this is the only known case where the sentence was confirmed to be execution. So after he was accused, Peter confessed to the court that he and another man had used a magical chant and ritual that had been taught to them by an old hunter to summon the SCLERA for 3 Thursdays in a row. And it involved like beating the surface of the water with a very specific type of stick and repeating, "I summon the sea wife by the names of 1,000 devils, I want to serve thee." After appearing to him, the SCLERA promised him good fortune in hunting and fishing, as well as offering to teach him something called hydromancy to help him track down lost items. And in exchange, he would provide her with physical relations and refuse his wife in bed, to which he agreed. Now, his wife actually backed this up in court. She confirmed that it had happened, it was true. And the story was basically interpreted as a form of witchcraft, and by authority standards, it was seen as Johnson having made a deal with the devil, and he was sentenced to death by the court and later burned at the stake. Now, in Slavic folklore, there is a creature known as the Alkonost, who is very similar in appearance to like the earlier depictions of sirens, being this like legendary bird with the head of a woman whose name came from the Greek goddess Alcyone. Now, the story of Alcyone is that her husband was killed by Zeus, because basically anything to do with Greek mythology involves Zeus either killing or sleeping with someone, but in her grief, Alcyone threw herself into the sea. But out of compassion, other gods transformed her and her husband into halcyon birds, or common kingfishers. Now, the Alkonost creature creates these like amazing sounds and beautiful bird songs, beautiful enough that those who hear it just forget everything that they know and never want for anything ever again. The Alkonost will lay her eggs on the beach and then sort of gently roll them into the sea. And it's said that when the eggs are ready to hatch, a thunderstorm will roll in and the sea will become so rough that it's basically impossible to travel across it. Now, the Alkonost lives in the underworld with her counterpart, the Siren, and according to folktales, on the morning of the Apple Feast of the Saviour Day, which is like an Eastern Slavic name for the Feast of Transfiguration, which was usually sometime in August, the Siren flies into an apple orchard and lets out a really sad and mournful cry. But then by the afternoon, the alchemist will fly to the same place and sing and laugh and rejoice. It's then said that the alchemist will brush dew droplets from her wings onto the trees, which grants healing powers to the fruits of the tree that she's sitting on. I saw some references that the alchemist and the Siren are sometimes known as the birds of joy and sorrow, but the Siren is actually a creature from Russian legends with the head of a beautiful woman and the body of a bird, which is usually an owl, though the Siren is based very directly on the Greek mythology of Sirens. Now, the alchemist was usually portrayed wearing a crown or sat with a nimbus, which is an outdated term for basically a type of dark cloud, and she sang beautiful songs to saints, predicting future happiness and bliss, that kind of thing. However, the bird was also very dangerous, and any man who was not a saint who heard her song would immediately just forget everything that he knew on Earth and follow her until he ultimately died. As such, people would try and sort of save themselves from the Siren by firing cannons or ringing bells, or just generally making as many loud noises as they could to try and scare the bird away. Now, the legend of the Siren is incredibly well documented, and it's believed to have been introduced by Persian merchants in the 8th or 9th century, and in a number of cities you can find the Siren depicted on pottery, gold pendants, and even on the borders of gospel books from sort of the 10th to 12th century. However, as you move to the 17th and 18th century, the image of the Siren changed, and she started to become kind of a symbol for world peace and eternal joy and heavenly happiness, because she was believed to live near paradise, and people in those times believed only happy people could hear the Siren's song, and even fewer would be able to see one because she is as fast and as difficult to catch as human happiness. Now, going over to the Philippines, which I'm sorry, I know we're darting around all over the place in terms of location and time frames, but this is just, I've tried to keep some sort of logic with what I'm doing, so just roll with me. But in the Philippines, there is a creature known as the Sirena, an aquatic creature with the head and torso of a human female, and from the waist down, the tail of a fish. And they are the Filipino counterpart to the English mermaid. Now, the Sirena is part of what is known as the Encanto, which is the name given to mythical environmental spirits said to have the ability to appear in human form, often being associated with the spirits and ancestors of the Philippines. Fun fact about that word is that it's basically used as a bracket term for enchanted human-like beings of the land, which includes a very huge variety of mythical races, and the term itself was adopted from the Spanish encanto, meaning enchanted, purely because the Spanish were apparently just dumbfounded by the sheer number and wide array of mythical races within Filipino legend, so they just referred to all of these races as enchanted. Now, whilst the Sirena is considered a counterpart to the mermaid, especially in appearance, the behaviour is much closer to that of a siren. So again, they have this beautiful and enchanting voice that can hypnotise men, fishermen especially, and they sing to sailors to distract them from their work and cause them to either walk off their ship or go off course and cause shipwrecks. They'll sometimes sing whilst hiding amongst the rocks on the shores, but in other tales they actually pretend that they need rescuing from drowning and then lure men into the sea only to drown them instead. So some stories state that the Sirena simply hypnotise the men into ending their own lives by just walking into the sea. Others claim that they drag them into the water themselves and then drown them, and then there's even further legends where it claims that they abduct the men and carry them under the water to then be sacrificed to different water deities. Many Filipino myths describe Sirena who drown fishermen and warriors, and in some stories They're like the guardians of the water in certain areas, and they shield it from the tattooed raiders of the Visayas, one of the 3 major island groups that like makes up the Philippines. As I said before, whilst legends of things like the Siren and the Sirena seem to come directly from the Greek Sirens, obviously there are many other tales and stories of cultures that have their own like variations on the beautiful but deadly woman, one of which comes from Manipur in India, known as the Heloi of Meitei mythology. Now, appearance-wise, the Heloi are female nature spirits, or evil spirits in some cases, who are often depicted in the form of beautiful young women. They are one of the most common female spirits believed in Meitei mythology, but according to the priests and priestesses of the ancient Manipur kingdom, they were also the most powerful female spirits. They were associated with the seduction of men and were able to spread disease, specifically sexually transmitted diseases, but they were known for attacking men and causing disorders of the mind. Now, according to belief, the highest rates of attacks occur in March and April. This is during the time of a spring festival when people come together to celebrate, and there are dances that are held between men and women. There's something known as Heloi Oknaba, which is Meitei for meeting with Helois, and it's one of the most common occurrences of meeting a supernatural being within Meitei folklore. Now, any kind of like challenge or conflict that comes from meeting with a Heloi will often make your life incredibly difficult and unhappy. This includes becoming sick, suffering from mental imbalances, or even like temporary madness. And if you're not properly treated by a priest or a priestess, the symptoms can become long-term and it can lead to permanent madness, because it's said that anyone who meets a Heloi will often act very strangely and irrationally afterwards, not being able to recognise their family or their friends, but still being able to communicate with the Heloi. Now, Helois don't give up their victims easily, and they usually demand something in return in order to let them go. So the priests and priestesses will often perform like rites and rituals to try and prevent any kind of attraction from the Heloi to men, and eventually try and prevent them from attacking them in the first place. And this can involve like preparing special like ritualized foods, or in some cases I saw they used to feed like animal feces to the spirits. I'm now moving on to like the last little bits of the information that I have to share with you, so I'm just gonna go and do like the final little touches of this look, and then we can round this all off because I am losing my voice at this point. I'm trying to work out if it's gone a bit more alien-esque than I'd originally planned, but I mean, I'm pretty happy with it, to be fair, so... But we will come back to this in just a moment. So we just covered some of the folklore and mythical creatures from like the Philippines and places in India, but if you move back over this way, there is another mythological creature that can be compared to sirens, and they are the Morgans or Morgans. They are water spirits from Welsh and Breton folklore. Now, I had to look up what Breton was because my brain immediately thought of the magic users in Skyrim. It's not them. They were descendants of settlers who moved from Great Britain to Brittany, which we now know as like northwest France, and this was from like the 3rd century onwards. Now, the settlers maintained a lot of ancient Celtic mythology, which is why they're so closely linked to like Wales and Cornwall and those kind of beliefs. So the Morgans, or the Morgans, or in some cases the Mary Morgans, are water spirits that drown men. Their name is believed to mean like seaborn, but it may also be linked to the Irish Muirgan, which was an alternative name of Liban, which was a princess who was transformed into a mermaid when her city was flooded, the legend of which is believed to have formed Loch Ness. Now, in Breton legend especially, the Mary Morgans were eternally young, beautiful spirits who sat in the water, combing their hair, and luring sailors in with their hypnotic voices. They were believed to live near the coast and at the entrances to caves and the mouths of rivers, and were very well versed in evil spells, and they were known for dragging men under the water who would then never be seen again. There are some versions that have the Mary Morgans kidnapping sailors and carrying them underwater to these palaces made of like mother of pearl and crystals in order to actually marry them. But they were also very often blamed for any kind of like heavy flooding that destroyed crops or villages. And the most prominent tale of this is the legend of Daut, which was a princess associated with the drowned city of Ys. I've probably got all these names really wrong. I'm really sorry. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning. Please just bear with me. Now, this legend dates back to like the 15th and 16th century, with a few variations in the tale. So in the early versions, the shameless Daut plans to kill her father, King Gradlon, and steal his key. The key symbolised his royalty, and it was her wickedness that caused a storm which flooded the city, and she died in the storm. However, in most retellings, the city is protected from the flood by like a slope or a wall, to which the king has the key for the gates, and his daughter is described as wicked and lustful, with many different lovers, who in some tales she like murders her lovers after she's been with them, until the devil himself comes to try and seduce her. Now, she manages to steal the key from her father, and during one of her physical times with a lover, she winds up opening the gates, which then floods the city. Now, King Gradlon was woken up by a saint who warned him of the danger, and he attempted to flee on his horse with his daughter riding behind him until his daughter ended up in the water. It's debated as to whether she fell in or he pushed her, but either way, the king is then able to ride off to safety. Once in the water, the daughter transforms into a Mary Morgan, who then haunts the area and can still be heard singing amongst the ruins of the city that can also still be seen under the water. And that lovely little tale brings us to the end, because I did not plan out a smoother way of rounding everything off. So, but that is the legend and the tales of the Sirens, from ancient Greece to a TikTok trend, and pretty much everywhere in between. I really enjoyed doing this research. I really enjoy mythology surrounding powerful or dangerous female creatures, so things like the banshees, sirens, the gorgons. I don't know what it is, it's just powerful mythological women who inspire this level of fear and respect. It's just... But anywho, let me know what you guys think. Which was your favourite, like, variation on the folklore? Which tale did you guys like? I genuinely really like all of them. I am overall pretty happy with how this look turned out. I wanted to stick with the features that people associate with sirens, i.e. the gills, the more mermaidy kind of aspect, but a bit darker. But I wanted to give like at least some kind of nod towards the original bird aspect, which is why I've tried to emulate this kind of like feathery texture almost. I don't know if it's worked, but let me know. Let me know who or what you guys would like me to cover next time. Other than that, I hope you all have a fabulous day and week and everything else. I am very grateful to all of you, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.